Welcome to Sleepy Case Files, a place where quiet storytelling meets mysterious cases. Tonight, we slowly explore a story from the world of true crime. Behind the closed doors of America's wealthy Victorian homes, respectability was everything. Scandals were hushed, voices were kept low, and extreme violence was an unthinkable horror that only happened to other people. But on one fateful summer day, inside a quiet, unassuming house in Fall River, Massachusetts, that polite illusion was violently, permanently shattered. Imagine the morning of August 4th, 1892, in Fall River, Massachusetts. The heat is already oppressive by 9 o'clock, hanging in the air like a wet woolen blanket. The air smells of coal dust from the nearby textile mills, mixing with the sweet, sickening scent of rotting fruit in the summer sun. At 92, 2nd Street stands a narrow olive green house. Inside, the air is stagnant. Andrew Borden, a man worth nearly $500,000, refuses to install gas lighting or indoor plumbing. The house smells of old wood, kerosene, and the lingering odor of days-old boiled mutton. But beneath the oppressive heat and the smell of the breakfast mutton lies a cold, hard timeline of a double homicide. Today we are not just telling a ghost story, we are going to open the police files, we are going to examine the autopsies, the shifting alibis, and the physical evidence of one of the most perfectly executed locked room murders in American history. The true horror of the Borden case is found not in the weapon, but in the clock. To understand the crime, we must look at the medical examiner's report. Dr. William Dolan, the medical examiner for Bristol County, arrived at the scene and later conducted the autopsies on the dining room table of the Borden house. In 1892, forensic science was primitive. There was no blood typing, no DNA, and fingerprinting was not yet accepted in American courts. But Dr. Dolan utilized a crucial forensic tool, digestion analysis. He removed the stomachs of both Andrew and Abby Borden to examine the partially digested remains of their mutton and broth breakfast. The results were undeniable. Abby Borden's digestion had stopped completely, while Andrew's stomach contents were significantly further along in the digestive tract. Dr. Dolan concluded with scientific certainty that Abby Borden died at least 1.5 hours before her husband. This single forensic fact changes the entire psychological profile of the killer. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a sudden, blinding crime of passion. After delivering 19 crushing blows to Abby's skull in the upstairs guest room, the killer did not panic. They did not flee. Instead, the killer waited. For 90 minutes, in the suffocating heat of that house, the murderer sat in the silence. They listened to the maid, Maggie, washing windows outside. They waited for Andrew Borden to come home. This was a crime of extreme calculation and cold-blooded patience. At 11:15 a.m., Officer George Allen became the first policeman to arrive at the scene, responding to Lizzie's cry that her father was dead. What he and the subsequent officers found was a forensic nightmare. The Fall River police force was unprepared for a crime of this magnitude. Within an hour, a dozen officers, medical men, and neighbors were tramping through the house. They tracked dirt across the floors, touched door handles, and entirely failed to secure the crime scene. Yet, despite the contamination, Officers Fleet and Mullally established one absolute fact. The house was a locked fortress. Every window on the ground floor was locked from the inside. The cellar door was bolted from within. The front door had been locked with a spring lock, a deadbolt, and a heavy chain. For an outside intruder to have committed this crime, they would have had to pick a complex lock in broad daylight, murder Abby, wait 90 minutes, murder Andrew, and then somehow lock the doors from the inside as they vanished. Logically, the investigators concluded the impossible. The killer never breached the perimeter. The killer was already inside. The only two people known to be on the property were Bridget Maggie Sullivan, the maid, and 32-year-old Lizzie Borden. The most damning evidence against Lizzie Borden was not a bloody weapon. It was her own words. On the day of the murders, Lizzie's statements to the police were a maze of contradictions. When Officer Fleet asked her where she was when her father was brutally hacked to death in the sitting room, her story constantly shifted. First, she claimed she was outside in the barn, up in the loft, looking for lead sinkers for an upcoming fishing trip. But when officers examined the barn loft, the thick layer of dust on the floorboards was completely undisturbed. Furthermore, the temperature in that unventilated loft was estimated to be over 120 degrees Fahrenheit that morning. It was an unbearable, suffocating heat for a woman in a heavy Victorian dress to casually spend 20 minutes looking for fishing gear. When confronted, Lizzie changed her narrative. She said she was not looking for sinkers, but eating pears in the loft. Then she claimed she was simply standing near the window looking out. Her explanation for her stepmother's whereabouts was equally flawed. Lizzie claimed Abby had received a handwritten note from a messenger boy asking her to visit a sick friend. Yet the police tore the house apart and no note was ever found. No messenger boy ever came forward. The sick friend did not exist. It was a phantom alibi designed to explain why Lizzie thought she was alone in the house with her father. A week after the murders, Lizzie took the stand at the coroner's inquest. For 3 days, District Attorney Hosea Knowlton relentlessly questioned her. Her testimony was a disaster. Lizzie's answers were erratic. When asked simple questions about her timeline, she frequently answered, "I don't know," or "I cannot remember." However, her legal team later revealed a critical medical detail. During the inquest, Lizzie was heavily medicated. The family physician, Dr. Bowen, had prescribed her double doses of morphine to help her cope with the shock. This created a massive legal controversy. Was Lizzie deliberately lying to cover her tracks? Or was her brain severely clouded by a powerful narcotic? This question of her mental state would become a linchpin in the legal battles to come. Law enforcement desperately needed the murder weapon. They drained the local privies, searched the gutters, and combed the neighbors' yards. Finally, in the dusty, dark basement of the Borden house, Officer Fleet found a hatchet head. It was an unusual piece of evidence. The heavy wooden handle had been recently broken off. The metal head itself was covered in a thick layer of white ash, resting near the basement furnace. To the prosecution, the narrative was clear. Lizzie had used this hatchet, washed the wet blood off the iron blade, and deliberately broken the handle to hide the blood that had soaked deep into the wood grain. She then rolled the wet metal head in furnace ash to make it look old, dusty, and unused. But without the handle and with no visible blood remaining on the iron, it was purely circumstantial. But there was another piece of physical evidence that could not be ignored. The blue dress. On Sunday morning, 3 days after the murders, Alice Russell, a close friend of the sisters, walked into the Borden kitchen. The air was thick with the smell of burning fabric. Lizzie was standing in front of the cast iron coal stove, tearing apart a blue corduroy silk dress and feeding it into the flames. When Alice asked what she was doing, Lizzie softly replied that the dress was covered in old paint. The prosecution believed it was covered in the arterial spray of her father's blood. The fire consumed the truth. The trial of Lizzie Borden, held in June 1893, is studied by legal scholars today primarily because of what the jury was never allowed to hear. Lizzie was represented by George Robinson, the former governor of Massachusetts. He was a brilliant tactician who knew exactly how to manipulate the three presiding judges. Before the jury even heard the opening statements, Robinson won 2 massive legal victories that gutted the prosecution's case. First, the defense argued that Lizzie's disastrous contradictory testimony at the coroner's inquest should be thrown out. They argued that because she was essentially a suspect but had not yet been formally charged or given legal counsel, her constitutional rights had been violated. The judges agreed. The jury never heard about Lizzie's shifting barn alibis or the phantom note. Second, the prosecution attempted to introduce an incident at a local pharmacy. The day before the murders, multiple witnesses saw Lizzie try to buy 10 cents worth of prussic acid, a lethal, fast-acting poison. She claimed she needed it to clean a sealskin cape, but the pharmacist refused to sell it without a prescription. The defense argued this was irrelevant and highly prejudicial. Again, the judges sided with the defense. The prosecution was stripped of its strongest circumstantial evidence. They were left trying to prove that a wealthy, church-going Victorian woman had violently hacked her parents to death without being able to show the jury her most suspicious behavior. The hardest evidence suppressed, the trial shifted from forensic facts to a debate about sociology and gender. The defense strategy was masterful. They leaned heavily into the cult of true womanhood, a dominant social ideology of the 1890s. They looked at the jury, 12 men, mostly farmers and tradesmen, and asked them to look at Lizzie. She sat in the courtroom dressed in mourning black, holding a fan of delicate lace. The defense attorney pointed to her and asked the jury, could this woman, who teaches your children the Bible, who brings flowers to the sick? Could she take a hatchet and swing it with the force of a lumberjack? It is a physical and moral impossibility. They argued that whoever killed Andrew and Abby would have been drenched in blood. How could Lizzie have committed the murders, completely cleaned herself, hidden the bloody clothes, and appeared perfectly calm when Maggie the maid saw her just minutes later? The jury could not bridge the psychological gap. They could not reconcile the extreme, visceral brutality of the crime scenes with the quiet, corseted woman sitting before them. On June 20th, 1893, the jury deliberated for barely an hour. The verdict was not guilty. Lizzie Borden was legally exonerated, but history has never stopped investigating her. Over the last century, alternative theories have emerged. Some investigators point to William Borden, Andrew's alleged illegitimate son, who supposedly demanded money from Andrew on the morning of the murders. Others point to Maggie, the maid. She was the only other person in the house. Some historians theorize that Lizzie and Maggie conspired together, which is why Maggie's testimony at the trial was surprisingly favorable to Lizzie. After the trial, Maggie left Fall River with a substantial amount of money. Money some believe was a payout for her silence. Lizzie lived out the rest of her days in a grand mansion called Maplecroft, exiled by the high society of Fall River. She died in 1927. The files remain open in the court of public opinion. It is a case built on broken locks, burned dresses, and excluded evidence. We have the timelines. We have the forensics. We have the layout of the house. But the final piece of the puzzle, the truth of who swung the hatchet in the stagnant heat of that August morning, remains locked inside 92 2nd Street. The investigation rests. The house is quiet.